Hello, everybody. This is the Classic English Literature Podcast. Today, we're returning to our proper place in the literary timeline after a couple of little detours down the primrose path of dalliance. We're back in Stuart, England, after reviving Hamlet and dodging a Viking raid, and I think we've earned a contemplative episode, a bit more philosophical than we've gotten in a little while. Today, we're going to look at the work of Francis Bacon. No, not the painter with a thing for shrieking popes, but the philosopher and scientist. To begin this discussion, let me ask you a question. Now, it's a real basic question. Real basic. You ready? Okay. How do you know that you know something? This is the fundamental question in a major field of philosophy called epistemology, which is the study of knowledge or of knowing. How do you know that you know something? Like, first, how do we know at all? What does that even mean? And then, how can we be confident that the things we claim to know are true? How can we tell that what we think of as knowledge isn't just belief? Plato, in his dialogue Theaetetus, famously defines knowledge as justified true belief. Justified true belief. So let's break this down. In order to know something, Plato says 3 criteria must be met. Number 1, belief. The individual must believe the proposition or statement in question. So, for instance, if someone claims to know that it will rain tomorrow, they must genuinely believe that it will rain. Number 2 is truth. The belief must be true. If it doesn't correspond to reality, that is, it doesn't rain as believed, then the knowledge claim is false. And finally, justification. The individual must have justification for their belief. This means there should be good reasons or evidence supporting that belief, making it reasonable to hold it. Now, it's this third one that trips us up, isn't it? What counts as justifying a belief? Well, historically, there have been 3 big justifications. The first one is revelation. That is, a belief is justified as knowledge because a god or the gods have revealed it to be so. Okay, now no offense to any of my religious listeners, but I'm not going to dwell on this one today because it kind of seems to me like a tautology. You need another belief to justify the first belief. Moving on then. The second justification has been what we can broadly call rationalism. Now, this can be a slippery term, but what I mean by it here is logically reasoning from a given proposition to a new conclusion without any need to rely on sense experience to validate the new knowledge. Maybe the most widely known rationalist thinker to the general public is 17th century French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes, who famously suspended his belief in everything that could be doubted on any level. Like, he even doubted that this was his own body, this was his own hand, because he could be hallucinating, or an evil demon might be trying to deceive him. The only thing he could not doubt was that he was doubting, and that meant there had to exist a thing that doubted, and therefore he could be sure of his own existence. Now, from this premise, he proceeds to rebuild his knowledge of the world on similarly rationalistic principles. Finally, the third justification we'll call, because this is its name, empiricism. Now, empiricism posits that all knowledge begins in sense experience, right? The things that we can taste and touch and see and hear in the world around us. So we make observations, we collect data, we run experiments. Now, from these sensations, we can inductively reason to some new conclusions about the world. It's kind of the opposite of rationalism, which is suspicious of sensory experience. Empiricism is skeptical that logic alone can be trusted without reference to concrete experiences. Now, it's this kind of thinking that Sir Francis Bacon urges us to embrace. All right, so let's talk about Mr. Bacon, one of the most brilliant minds of the Elizabethan age, lawyer, philosopher, statesman, scientist, and, well, the guy who basically said, yeah, you know what? Let's actually test things before we decide they're true. He was born in 1561, a well-connected kid, because his dad was Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, and his mom was a highly educated, slightly terrifying woman who made sure Francis was reading Latin and Greek by the time most of us were figuring out which shoe goes on which foot. The young prodigy caught the eye of Queen Elizabeth, who fondly called him the young Lord Keeper. But she never came through with the advancement he craved. Under King James, things started picking up. He rose to become Attorney General and eventually Lord Chancellor, one of the most powerful positions in England. But as much as Bacon was into politics, his true love was science and philosophy. He basically invented the scientific method, or at least he popularized it, and his work Novum Organum, which is the most famous part of a larger work published in 1620 called the Instaurationis Magna, the Great Instauration. Instauration meaning restoring or renewing something. Novum Organum argued that humans should use observation and experimentation to figure out how the world works, rather than relying on old, dusty books that built logical arguments from divinely revealed premises. The full title of Novum Organum is Novum Organum sive indicia vera de interpretatione natura, the New Organon, or True Directions Concerning the Interpretation of Nature. That's quite a bold claim in that subtitle. But basically, it's his method that has given us our understanding of what constitutes true knowledge. In the preface to Novum Organum, Bacon sets out to challenge basically the Aristotelian biases of his day. In fact, Bacon's title directly rips Aristotle's work Organum, the Greek's treatise on logic and syllogism. Bacon argues that such logical analysis is a faulty method of attaining true knowledge, and that it should be replaced by empirical observation. In that preface, he writes, "They who have presumed to dogmatize on nature, as on some well-investigated subject, either from self-conceit or arrogance, and in the professorial style, have inflicted the greatest injury on philosophy and learning. For they have tended to stifle and interrupt inquiry exactly in proportion as they have prevailed in bringing others to their opinion. And their own activity has not counterbalanced the mischief they have occasioned by corrupting and destroying that of others. They again, who have entered upon a contrary course, and asserted that nothing whatever can be known, whether they have fallen into this opinion from their hatred of the ancient sophists, or from the hesitation of their minds, or from an exuberance of learning, have certainly adduced reasons for it which are by no means contemptible." The mischief Bacon chides here are some of the most famous doctrines in Western history, doctrines based on sound logical reasoning, but utterly incorrect in reality. For instance, the circular orbit of the planets put forward by Plato and Aristotle, or the theory of spontaneous generation, the idea that flies just instantly popped out of rotting meat, or vitalism, the belief that living things have a non-material life force that animates them. Or what about the medieval theory of the four humors, which we talked about in the Ben Jonson episodes? Or the divine right of kings that we talked about in the episode on English translations of the Bible. All of these scientific and political theories are perfectly reasonable, but they're also perfectly wrong. And they're wrong because, while the conclusion may flow logically from the premises, they have no correspondence to actual physical reality. So, as long as we honor the arguments of long dead authorities like Plato and Aristotle and the Church Fathers, we remain ignorant of the world as it truly is. In an ironically Aristotelian way, though, Bacon advocates a, quote, more prudent mean between the arrogance of dogmatism and the despair of skepticism. And that is to put everything, quote, to the test of experience. What Bacon's advocating for here is called inductive reasoning, which is basically just the art of figuring things out by observing the world and drawing conclusions from it. And if you're thinking, well, that sounds pretty obvious, you're right. But back in the day, this was revolutionary stuff. So here's the gist. Inductive reasoning starts with specific observations and works its way up to a general theory. You see something happen a few times and then say, hey, maybe this is a rule. So imagine you've eaten 100 tacos and they were all delicious. So you start thinking, all tacos must be delicious. Boom, inductive reasoning in action. Now, here's the twist, though. You can't be 100% sure that the next taco you eat won't taste like hot tuna in a dirty diaper. But based on all the tacos you've eaten, it's a pretty solid guess. This is how the scientific method works too. You run experiments, gather data, and from that data you build up theories about how stuff works. So inductive reasoning isn't foolproof, it's not a crystal ball, but it's a pretty good way to take a bunch of facts and turn them into something useful. And use is what Bacon is after. In his essay titled Of Studies, Bacon opens arguing that, quote, studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. And he defines ability as, quote, the judgment and disposition of business. And business here means, getting things done. He says, quote, crafty men condemn studies, simple men admire them, and wise men use them. Now, by the way, you'll notice as you read Bacon that he is a great lover of what writers call parallel structure. Parallel structure is the repetition of a specific grammatical form or pattern within a sentence or across sentences. So if I gave you more opening sentences to the essay, you'll see how they parallel each other. Check it out. Studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. Their chief use for delight is in privateness and retiring. For ornament is in discourse, and for ability is in the judgment and disposition of business. ... To spend too much time in studies is sloth, to use them too much for ornament is affectation, to make judgment wholly by their rules is the humor of a scholar. See, it's like giving your writing a rhythm by making sure that similar parts of a sentence are balanced and they flow together nicely. When elements in a series or a list have the same structure, the writing feels more cohesive and easier to read. But in this instance, note how he tweaks the ending of the last sentence. One studies, he says, for delight, ornament, and ability. Too much delight leads to sloth and laziness. Too much ornament leads to affectation, people thinking you're a witless show-off. And too much ability and judgment, that is to be a true scholar, to possess true knowledge. The shift from negative outcomes to the supremely positive one it's a neat rhetorical trick because it snaps the reader's attention to the final climactic point, Now, Bacon doesn't have any time for relativists, people who believe that everything depends on some kind of context or that everything is up for interpretation. In an essay called Of Truth, he opens with an allusion to Pontius Pilate. Quote, "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. I just want to say that there is something so perfect, so elegant in this opening line. The essay broadly examines the idea of lying to others and lying to ourselves, actually, and what it is about human nature that makes us do so. But to explore this, Bacon has to dispense with the relativists who say that there really isn't any truth. And he does so by making Pilate, after his famous question to Jesus Christ, turn on his heel and leave before the Son of God can tell him. Arrogantly ignorant. Doesn't know, doesn't want to know, doesn't even know that he doesn't know. What a buffoon! Who wants to be like Pilate? The essay's next sentence likens Pilate to the Greek sophists, those philosophical guns for hire who would argue any position for the right price without regard for truth or right. Bacon says, quote, "Certainly there can be that delight in giddiness and count it a bondage to fix a belief, affecting free will in thinking as well as in acting. But though the sex of philosophers of that kind be gone, yet there remain certain discoursing wits which are of the same veins, though there be not so much blood in them as was in those of the ancients." Ha ha! Nice sideswipe there at Renaissance relativists and sophists, who even lack the pluck and verve of the OGs. They're in the same vein, but they don't have as much blood. Oh, touche, Francis, touche. Now that the opposition has been dealt with, Bacon carries on his argument. And that argument is, curiously, that lying is a pleasure. Wait a minute, Frank. I thought we were on the eternal quest for true knowledge guiding by the flaming pillars of experience and induction. What do you mean that lying is fun, even fundamentally human? Explain what you mean by this, Frank, huh? What's this mean? "Truth may perhaps come to the price of a pearl that showeth best by day, but it will not rise to the price of a diamond or carbuncle that showeth best in varied lights. A mixture of a lie doth ever add pleasure. Doth any man doubt that if we were taken out of men's minds vain opinions, flattering hopes, false valuations, imaginations as one would, and the like, but it would leave the minds of a number of men poor shrunken things full of melancholy and indisposition and unpleasing to ourselves?" Okay, I kind of buy the imaginations as one would. After all, poetry and fiction are in some sense lies. That's why Plato hated poets. But then he also hated sleeping, drinking, games, music, theater, kittens probably. Ever notice how many of the great people of history would be dreadful if they weren't dead? Does a lot to moderate the personality, death. What Bacon points out here is that such fleeting, transient, effervescent lies, what he calls the shadow of a lie, have no detrimental effect on the mind. But he urges that the inquiry of truth is the sovereign good of human nature. He offers a lovely analogy to clarify what may otherwise seem a contradictory, or at best paradoxical, point. The, quote, "mixture of falsehood is like alloy in coin of gold and silver, which may make the metal work the better, but it embaseth it." So a little fleeting lie mixed into the truth may be more expedient or entertaining, but like mixing a base metal with a precious one, the quality of truth is debased. This inquiry of truth, so apotheosized by Bacon, is often thwarted by what he calls the idols of the mind. And this is perhaps the most generally known section of the Novum Organon. Idols here are false notions or obstacles to clear observation and induction. He says, The idols and false notions which are now in possession of the human understanding and have taken deep root therein not only beset men's minds that truth can hardly find entrance, but even after entrance is obtained, they will again, in the very instauration of the sciences, meet and trouble us, unless men, being forewarned of the danger, fortify themselves as far as may be against their assaults. So he identifies 4 classes of the idols and explains their insalubrious effect. Now, these are the idols of the tribe, the idols of the cave, the idols of the theater, and the idols of the marketplace. Let's have a look at each one of these. Now, first up, idols of the tribe. These are the universal flaws baked into the human brain. The kind of errors we all make because, we're human. Bacon admitted that our senses deceive us and that we have this nasty habit of thinking the world is more orderly and rational than it actually is. We might call this today confirmation bias or the availability heuristic or apophenia, which is this human tendency to see patterns in random events or objects. Conspiracy theories thrive on this kind of stuff. Basically, we see what we want to see, and that leads us down the wrong path. Like, think about social media algorithms. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube use algorithms to show users content they're more likely to engage with, often reinforcing their existing beliefs. This leads to echo chambers where people primarily encounter information that supports their views. For instance, during political campaigns or controversial news events, people often only see content that aligns with their prior beliefs. This reinforces shared biases and makes it harder to see things from an opposing or neutral perspective, and distorting the collective understanding of complex issues. This is an idol of the tribe because it reflects a collective tendency to interpret the world in ways that affirm our preconceptions rather than seeking objective or conflicting evidence. Next up, the idols of the cave. These are the individual biases that come from our personal experiences, our education, and our temperament, our mood. Think of Plato's cave, where the prisoners only saw shadows of reality. Except in Bacon's version, each of us is stuck in our own cave, shaped by our unique perspective on the world. He says, "For everyone has a cave or den of his own, which refracts and discolors the light of nature, owing either to his own proper and peculiar nature, or to his education and conversation with others, or to the reading of books, and the authority of those whom he esteems and admires, or to the differences of impressions accordingly as they take place in a mind preoccupied and predisposed, or in a mind indifferent and settled, or the like." If you're raised to think all dogs are dangerous, for example, you're going to jump to conclusions every time you hear a bark. It's personal, subjective, and a total block to seeing things clearly. You ever had a conversation with someone whose views or opinions are just way, way off base, like someone who doesn't like tacos, or someone who believes the world is flat? And have you noticed that no matter how cogent your argument, no matter how many facts or data and sources you present to the guy, he still just refuses to believe that the world is round? That's the idol of the cave. Or take someone skeptical of climate change, perhaps due to cultural or regional factors, like maybe they work in industries that are dependent on fossil fuels. They might personally downplay scientific evidence supporting the argument that humans affect climate change. Their cave is shaped by their specific experiences, leading them to interpret data through a lens that differs from someone raised in a different environment. Even when presented with the same scientific facts, people's personal experiences heavily influence how they interpret and accept that information. The idols of the cave illustrate how personal circumstances can skew one's view of reality, even in the face of clear evidence. Third in line are the idols of the marketplace. Now, this is the one I think about the most because it's about language. And language is a trickier beast than a bridge dealing bulldog. This category deals with how sloppy language messes with our thoughts. And he calls this a problem of the marketplace because that is where people go to metaphorically exchange ideas. He says, quote, "For it is by discourse that men associate, and words are imposed according to the apprehension of the vulgar, and therefore the ill and unfit choice of words wonderfully obstructs the understanding." We get tangled up in words, often thinking they represent real, solid concepts when sometimes they're just social noise or half-baked ideas that sound more important than they really are. We might think about jargon from particular industries or fields of study, language intended to impress or dazzle or exclude the non-insider. Or we could think about the concept of semantic broadening, what I sometimes call term creep. This is the phenomenon whereby a word used to mean something very specific in the past, but its meaning has expanded to cover almost any similar situation. I've noticed that lately the word empathy, which means vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another, has largely replaced the word sympathy in our discourse. Sympathy is feeling sincere concern for someone experiencing something difficult or painful. Or take, for instance, the word genocide. It used to mean a conscious and planned effort for the extermination of an entire people. Now, the Holocaust is, of course, the textbook example. But in the last couple of years, it has been more loosely applied to any conflict involving a racial or ethnic clash. Now, semantic broadening is a quite natural linguistic phenomenon, and I fully accept and even sometimes relish the organic quality of language. It is, after all, it's the possession of the community which uses it, right? It's not the provenance of prescriptive lexicographers. But I also recognize that if we water down our terms, how can we meaningfully deal with matters of degree and scale when confronting the challenges of existence? The same thing goes for euphemisms. The language that softens so as not to shock or offend. Now, sure, there's no big deal calling it the restroom instead of the shitter. It's just more polite. But what about language that obscures the reality of a condition? I've recently heard the term food insecure used to describe people who don't have enough to eat. But a newscaster saying there are hundreds of families with food insecurity doesn't prompt in me the same humanitarian, compassionate, urgent response that hundreds of families are starving does. You know what I mean? A deeper issue with the idols of the marketplace is that terms we use for a specific issue or idea might differ depending on our attitude toward that issue. With the idol of the cave. Is it euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide? Is abortion an issue of bodily autonomy or infant murder? Why are they freedom fighters if we like them, but terrorists if we don't? How can we clearly debate issues if we use different subjective terms to investigate an objective reality? Now, on a lighter note, people's heads exploded about a dozen years ago when Merriam-Webster's dictionary offered a definition of the word literally, meaning, quote, in effect, virtually. Ho! People cried, we've reached the end times. There are no standards anymore. Up is down and words have no meaning. Okay, folks, loosen your collar. World's not ending. In fact, we have instances of the figurative use of literally going back to 1769. And even Charles Dickens used it this way in his 1839 novel Nicholas Nickleby. It's an example of what are called contronyms, words that are their own opposites, their own antonyms. Think about words like cleave, which means to cling together or to break apart, or the word sanction. It means to approve or to penalize. Peruse, to study carefully or to skim quickly. Things like context and tone and body language clarify these usages in real life, so there's no need to get your wicket sticky. And let's not even get started on the uproar and consternation occasioned by the recent reintroduction of singular pronouns they, them, their, and theirs. But fear not, the sun shall rise tomorrow. Anyway, I seem to have rabbit-holed this conversation. Started talking about idols of the marketplace and found myself babbling about Janus words. It's just I find these problems really interesting because I tend to believe that language plays a very active role in constructing the reality in which we live. And if language does not or cannot describe reality, but can only describe metaphors for reality, then we're forever caught in an epistemological pickle. Finally, the idols of the theater. Bacon saved the most dramatic one for last. These are the dogmas and philosophies we've inherited that shape how we see the world. Kind of like being trapped in someone else's poorly written play. Whether it's religion, political ideology, or some outdated scientific theory, these theatrical systems of thought keep us from thinking critically. Bacon wasn't a fan of people who blindly accepted received wisdom. He was all about clearing the stage and looking at the evidence fresh. Bacon hoped that by revealing and identifying these idols of the mind, these hindrances to clear thinking could be avoided by a new generation who could reconstruct knowledge as a useful explanation of nature. Bacon's institution of a scientific method and an inductive philosophy continues to dominate our approach to knowledge to this very day, right? We're all Baconists in some way. We believe in science. And even if you're suspicious of the hegemony of modern science, or scientism in its extreme form, and you believe that there exists some knowledge that can only be learned through revelation or intuition or meditation, that science does not have the total monopoly on what can be true. Almost all of us take an I'll believe it when I see it attitude in everyday life. Like when I feel ill, I'm not looking to intuition to save me, right? I want somebody in a white coat with a wall full of diplomas telling me what chemicals to take and in what quantities. I want hard science when I'm sick. I want hard science making cars safe to drive. I want hard science making my food safe to eat, especially bacon. This episode has focused on Francis Bacon's contributions to the scientific revolution and his philosophical work, but I would be remiss if I did not mention, at least in passing, that adherents of the Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare crankery have often put Bacon forward as the real writer of the sonnets and plays that we sheep believe Shakespeare wrote. Allow me to say... Baconians point to Bacon's appropriate social class and educational background for the production of such profound literature, and argue that its nuanced understandings of human nature, political power, and ethics align more closely with Bacon's known worldview and intellectual interests. Some others note that Bacon was fascinated by ciphers and codes which could account for the depth of meaning in the plays. Finally, and here's the clincher, sometimes Bacon wrote under a pseudonym. Well, why couldn't William Shakespeare be the pen name Bacon used for writing drama? Well, why not indeed? Because it's absolute greasy rubbish, that's why. Mere coincidence and classist elitism do not a convincing argument make, and ironically, would certainly not withstand Bacon's own criteria for true knowledge. Enough said. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your time here. And if you did, Could I ask you a big favor? It'll only take a second. Could you please text one person and recommend the show? Like, you got your phone right there. Like, just send a message saying, "Hi, I've just heard this show and I think you'd really like it. Check it out and let me know what you think." That would really help build our community. Thanks for all your support, and I'll talk to you next time.